And this is 8:48 on WBEZ. I'm Allison Cuddy. Yesterday, ex-Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich joined a notorious group. He's now the fourth former head of the state to be convicted of criminal behavior. Blagojevich was found guilty on 17 of 20 counts. During his two federal corruption trials, Blagojevich and his lawyers made the case that his actions were not criminal, but rather business as usual in Illinois politics. That defense has provoked a hail of scorn from many quarters, including U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald, who led the investigation and prosecution of the ex-governor. So what does his trial and conviction mean for the state's corrupt practices? To explore, we'll take a couple of approaches. First, we're looking at the jury and their comments about the process. And to do that, we're joined by expert jury consultant Alan Tuerkheimer from Zagnoli McAvoy Foley. He's joining us by phone this morning. And we're joined by WBEZ's own criminal and legal affairs reporter, Robert Wildeboer. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Allison.
Hello.
Hi, Alan. Hello, Rob. Rob, as you wrote in your spot about this is a vastly different outcome than the first time around. And I want to play a clip where we have the jury talking about the process and sort of the decisions they were weighing. Because you've been on the show before. We've done lots of debriefs about the trial as it was playing out.
And we've talked a lot about the fact that the defense was saying that this was just politics as usual, as you said, and that Blagojevich, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just brainstorming. He's an ideas man. Throwing ideas out, and the jurors talked about that.
Exactly that. Floating an idea versus doing it. Let's take a listen.
He was being tried on attempting and not committing the crime. And when you say that you're going to float an idea as opposed to asking someone to do it, that's where it changed. And there were several times where he said, do it, push that, get this done. And I think that's where you cross the line of just floating an idea and actually doing it.
So that idea that the prosecutors tried to get across, the jury got it.
Yeah, and they were trying to push this legal idea of the attempt and say, if he made a phone call to further that scheme, he's not just brainstorming anymore. If he set up a meeting to further that scheme, he's not just brainstorming.
Alan, it's interesting in thinking about what made an impact on the jury. They talked about their relationship with, the thoughts they had about the ex-governor as they encountered him day to day in the courtroom. Let's hear a clip of that and their reaction to the ex-governor.
I think it made it, I wouldn't say it made it a bit harder, but because he was personable, it made it hard to separate that from what we actually had to do as jurors. We had to put aside the fact that whether we liked him or didn't like him and just go by the evidence that was presented to us.
So his testimony and his presence mattered, Alan, but in the end they said it was the tapes that really made the difference.
Well, the tapes were certainly incriminating, and that's information that I believe a lot of these jurors were repulsed by. They heard his harsh language, they heard what he said, and I think a lot of them felt that if he wasn't arrested, the completion of the crimes would have occurred. And to what that juror said, they, at the same time, they heard him for 7 days, and that's a long time for anybody to be on the stand, and they were able to compartmentalize, and they were able to like him, but they also found that he was manipulative and that he contradicted some of the concrete evidence in this case. He was not deemed overly credible, and likability is just one factor of credibility. Mm-hmm. Credibility has a lot of different facets. There's expertise, there's trustworthiness, there's knowledge, and so likability is just one dimension. And so they were able to like him and find him even perhaps charming at some times, but overall, I believe they rejected a good portion of his testimony. So
7 days on the stand, do you think that was maybe a misstep on the part of the defense? Familiarity breeds contempt, perhaps?
It was. Well, it was a catch-22. They really had to have him get on the stand and have him tell his story, but the ex-governor likes to talk, he likes to explain things, and he's very verbose, and he feels that he can talk anybody and convince them of anything. And so once he gets going, it's really hard for him to stop, and he got into his childhood, and he had some specific recollections, and it was just really hard to rein him in. And 7 days is, for anybody, a long time to be on the stand.
And I would just add, Allison, that, there was the one count where the jury did believe him, despite, they found him too incredible to believe on 17 counts. On one count, they voted not guilty, and they cited his testimony as convincing them that, he didn't do that scheme. So that's interesting that they also, like Alan said, they compartmentalized. They like him, but then they also found him guilty. They also found him guilty, but then also believed him at other times. Very interesting.
And then going back again to the prosecution strategy, those other two counts where they didn't reach a verdict, perhaps confusion or complicated count was a factor there.
Yeah,
the tollway counts.
And also what you mentioned, the tapes. The tapes weren't as strong for those counts.
I was also struck by their comments that they had a kind of a fear or a reaction to the prosecution when they started their case, when they started their cross of the ex-governor. Reed Shar came out and famously said, "You are a convicted liar, are you not?" And that really had an effect on them. Let's take a listen.
That scared us all to death. We were so nervous after that little segment of the trial that I think we were unanimous on that one. Yeah.
Why did it scare you?
Because it just, you know what, I think because the trial up until then had not been very dramatic. You know, as a juror going in, you don't know what trial is like. You know, you see trials on TV all the time. You think each and every one is like Law and Order, and they're all dramatic. And it didn't get dramatic until he came out and did that, and we're all just like, oh my God.
It was startling.
Yeah,
it was,
yeah.
Ellen, that's fascinating. I mean, I think there's been comparisons previously between U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald and someone else with a prosecutorial zeal like Elliot Ness. But what do you make of their reaction to the prosecution, the role they played in sort of developing or having an impact on the jury's deliberations?
Well, jurors hear evidence and they're given legal instructions, and it's a legal framework. But what jurors do is they construct an overarching case story, and they're looking for a narrative. And so what the prosecution did was set up this moment to really rivet the jurors and give them this aha moment. And that happens throughout trials, all kinds of trials, where there's this moment where jurors look back and think, yeah, at this point, this is really how I started to look at things differently. And that was one of them. It was teed off. And then from that point on, jurors were really paying attention and giving it their all when he was on the stand and being cross-examined.
Rob, the jury said that, they were very deliberate in their process. That's what took them the time, going through everything very carefully. They wanted to be that way. They also want their verdict to have an impact. They wanted to send a message. I mean, what do we make of that?
Yeah, I mean, they knew that they were being watched. They knew that this was a high-profile case. They knew that we reporters were in the courtroom the whole time. And it's interesting, though, that they wanted to send that message. But the last jury, if you think about it, on the Senate seat stuff, they were 11-1 to just revisit that. They were 11-1 on those Senate seat counts. So they were, thinking the same thing. But it was interesting, the unity on this jury yesterday, all of them, 12 of them coming in together to talk to reporters for about 20 minutes. And also, it's this kind of summer camp feeling, end of summer camp. They've spent like the last 2 months together. It's interesting because they have spent all day together, and they couldn't talk about the one thing they had in common. They're a bunch of strangers, and they couldn't talk about Blagojevich or the trial, their one shared experience. So yesterday there was a lot of hugging and, oh, yeah, we're going to stay in touch, and that was kind of interesting to watch as well.
Alan, just quickly, Pat Fitzgerald in his comments yesterday said this wasn't just the usual political haggling. What Blagojevich did was clearly criminal. Does this verdict, I mean, clearly the jury follows that logic, does this verdict have an impact on so-called horse trading in politics?
Really depends on what politicians now and future politicians, whether or not they heed this verdict. It remains to be seen, but certainly the jury was aware of this, and there's several schools of thought. One of them, this is horse trading, it happens all the time, so what, he's being singled out. This jury didn't embrace that argument. They embraced the notion that, no, there's a transgression here, and as one of the jurors said, I think it was a fourth person, this crossed the line. So it just remains to be seen whether or not people pay attention to this and politicians are aware and will change their practices in the state of Illinois. Remains to be seen.
Alan Tuerkheimer is a jury consultant with Zagnoli, McAvoy, Foley. Robert Wildeboer is WBEZ's criminal and legal affairs reporter. I want to thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks, Alison.
Thanks for having me.